a lot of folks here on Zoom, which is exciting. So we're getting a little bit of a late start. So I just wanted to preface by saying that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We may not get to all of them. I do have to chair a meeting at 11, so I have a hard stop for that. But we will get back to you, and we're also very available to chat and consult and talk about maybe individual workplace issues on this topic as well. So as we're getting started, I just want to mention a few things. I was chatting with Greg DeLapp this morning. He's presenting another webinar actually on EAPs and utilization. So first he says hello to all of his good friends at the DC chapter. And Greg and I have been chatting recently about the EAP and workplace response to our protests and social unrest and working towards racial equity and justice. I'm actually publishing an article now on how EAPs can be more anti-racist, and I'm working with the Harvard Business Review to put a version in that venue as well, which I think will hopefully provide some guidance for our field and also our workplaces. And Greg is asking for folks that may be involved in social justice work and racial equity work in the workplace to connect with him to talk about how EAPs can be more active and effective with both anti-racism and anti-oppression in the workplace. So happy to chat about that offline. I know it's not our topic today, but I will share those articles with the group as soon as they're published. It should be a few days. And our topic today on suicide does talk about issues of discrimination and prejudice in the workplace. As you're going to learn in the guidelines, we do talk about workplace toxic environments, policies, and practices that have direct links to suicide. So Sally and I are very happy to be here today, and thank you, Bob, for inviting us. Thank you, Amy, for the technical support, and we hope to have some slides up soon to get started. Amy? There we go.
All right.
She's awesome. So again, we're talking about suicide prevention and postvention today. We have a lot of content to cover, so we'll try to get through what we can. Our third co-presenter, Maggie Mortali, is not able to join us, but you'll see a picture of her in the slides and learn a little bit more about the 3 organizations that are disseminating the workplace suicide prevention. And shout out to Chris Carlo, who's a member of our committee. So it's good to see you here. Sally, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Next slide, please. So I always like to start off these presentations with a call to action to all the participants to be bold. Be vocal, be visible, be visionary. There's no shame in stepping forward, but there's great risk in holding back and just hoping for the best. And so throughout this presentation, I will be sharing a couple of stories of folks that have been bold, who've stepped into the arena and done some important work as early adopters to suicide prevention in the workplace. And again, I'll shout out to Chris Carlo because he's one of them. Many years ago, he got moved to make suicide prevention and mental health promotion key components to smart unions' well-being, and has been pushing forward innovative initiatives for many years now, and really for me is a model of how to do peer support involvement in the workplace in a very comprehensive and scaled way. So Chris, again, I'm also very grateful that you're here and for your leadership. Next slide. These are also 2 others that I'd like to share stories about to demonstrate what it looks like to be bold. The first on the left is Juan Vigil. I met Juan Vigil the summer of 2014, shortly after he had lost a beloved captain, Captain Steve Magana, to suicide. He wasn't just Juan's captain, he was a close friend of Juan, and Juan and many other firefighters of the Denver Fire Department were devastated by this loss. And a group of them got fire in the belly to do something, and they persisted and stumbled upon some work that we were doing in first responder suicide prevention and came to us, and we did many different things with them. But one of the things that we decided to do with them was an in-service that spanned the entire 1,200 person department that involved a video of the firefighters telling their stories. Now, it took us 18 months to warm up the firefighters to tell stories about suicide because no one had ever done that before. And Juan was one of the members who was fairly ambivalent about sharing his story of how suicide impacted him. And on the day that we did the video shoot, he pulled me aside and he said, "Sally, this is the scariest thing anyone has ever asked me to do." Now, remember, these folks run into burning buildings. "This is the scariest thing anyone has ever asked me to do. I'm going to do it because I believe it's the right thing, but I'm very frightened. And if you could just make me one promise, promised me that when you edit this video that you'll edit out my tears." And I said, "Of course, Juan, of course I will." And so he did the recording, very authentically shared the story of the aftermath of the suicide impact on him. We shared this training video with a lot of other components to all the firefighters and the members of this department. And 6 months later, we did a follow-up survey. And we asked the members, this was a 3.5-hour training, again, lots of different pieces to it, including an hour and a half on resilience. And we asked them, what do you remember about that training? What stuck out to you? What were your takeaways? And yeah, they had learned some things, but the number one thing that they said, Juan's video, that's what they called it. And right there, we knew the power of storytelling to shift culture. So more on Juan and what it meant to be a peer advocate and kind of rise to the top of his organization through his passion around this subject. The other leader that I like to highlight is John Kidding. John Kidding is the COO and Executive Vice President of RK. He and I met many years ago, around the same time that Juan and I met, when I was part of Leadership Denver. Now, when you're part of these leadership groups, you go network and you go out for coffee. So one morning, John and I are out for coffee, and he says to me, "Sally, you know, when you talk about who's at risk for suicide, you're talking about my folks." And I said, I know, John. He said, "Well, I don't want to wait until we have another tragedy. I want to do something now. So help us along." And so a lot of what we did with John Kidding back in the summer of 2014 is what we're going to share with you today. It's a whole enchilada of stuff of needs and strengths assessment and leadership communication and training and so on and so forth. And we're about 3 months into this work. And he turns to me and he says, "I've unleashed something here that I didn't even know existed. I had no idea how much my people were suffering, how much they were worried about their children, how much they had been impacted by suicide and other mental health crises. This is way too important for just my company. How do we help this go national?" And so his company's corporate foundation underwrote the development of the National Construction Industry Blueprint for Suicide Prevention. We launched that without any data to back it that this was an issue in construction. This was before the CDC started coming out with their reports. But because it was in a document that had national guidelines on it, it got a lot of traction. And he has continued to be a champion for suicide prevention and mental health promotion in construction ever since. So more on his and RK's story in just a bit. Next slide.
So we want to start off by introducing our partners. So again, Sally and I are here today, and usually Maggie joins us. She wasn't able to come today, but these are the 3 organizations that have been pulling together and disseminating the guidelines. Sally is also, amongst many things in her bio, the president of the United Suicide Survivors International Group. Most of you know I'm at the University of Maryland, co-chairing the Social Work in the Workplace and Employee Assistance subspecialization, and Maggie is at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And Sally and I both co-chair the Workplace Prevention and Postvention Committee for the American Association of Suicidology. Next slide. So here comes technology opportunity number 2, Amy. So we're going to open up a poll, hopefully, and we'd like you to take a couple seconds to respond. It's anonymous. But before today, were you familiar with the Suicide Prevention Workplace Guidelines? And if you can see the poll, go ahead and respond. And Amy, once you feel like we have a nice critical mass, you can go ahead and show the results. I have faith in you. There we go. Awesome. Well, we just presented to a group of 80 employers the other day, and let me say, your results are way better. So go EAP. So we do have some opportunities to learn some more, but I'm excited that almost half of you have heard about the guidelines. We can go ahead and close the poll and go to our next slide. All right, we can probably keep going for our I just introduced our partners. So today we're going to try to talk about a lot in not a lot of time, but mostly we want you to walk away today with knowing why suicide prevention needs to be a health and safety priority. So we'll introduce the guidelines and hopefully come up with at least one action step that you can take with your EAP, professional organization, or workplace that you support to start engaging in this pathway for suicide prevention. Next slide. Some of the things that we'll talk about more in depth are the 8 guiding principles and 9 practices. And we'll also go into the participant call to action, because we're hoping that you can work with us in promoting the guidelines to the workplaces that you support. Next slide. So let's get into a little bit of background on why this is so important for workplaces. And we'll go kind of quickly through this. It's important, and this is a slide you might want to consider using in your workplace. We believe that words make worlds, and words are very important. So the language is always changing in terms of how to talk about suicide, how to talk about death. But one of the main reasons that we're very focused on how to say certain things, how to write about certain things, is that we're trying to honor people's experiences and also reduce prejudice and discrimination. You'll see at the bottom, stigma is crossed out. That's personally something that I'm still working with. I'm so ingrained to talk about stigma. But when we think about access to health and mental health care, the differences in quality and how we treat folks that are struggling with mental health conditions, and then even further thinking about suicide ideation, we are really talking about prejudice and discrimination and trying to move away from talking about stigma. And you'll notice some of the other words are very objective and action focused. So rather than committed, which brings in kind of legal implications that suicide is somehow a sin, or successful and unsuccessful, further shaming someone that they're having suicide thoughts and behaviors and they can't be successful. We really just talk about suicide death, suicide attempt, someone living with thoughts and behaviors, and working to describe the behavior, as well as working with someone who has suicide thoughts or behaviors, rather than I have to deal with that person, or they're or it's a gesture or cry for help. So I just want to frame that today as we start off our conversation, and would be happy to chat more about this offline. Next slide. So a model that some of you may be familiar with is Dr. Thomas Joiner's model of suicide risk. And we present this and could probably do a whole day on this model, but we just want to highlight a couple key factors. If you are interested in learning more, I recommend reading Why People Die by Suicide, which is his book describing the model of risk. And one of the biggest takeaways from this model is to help folks think about how one goes from having suicidal thoughts to suicidal behaviors. And so Thomas Joiner talks about something called perceived burdensomeness, which is this desire to end psychological or emotional pain. And within burdensomeness, we think about how, for the workplace, what's going on right now with unemployment, underemployment, lack of autonomy in one's job, and just starting to feel like I'm a failure to my coworkers, to my community, to my family. This reflects at work and home and can make things much worse when people, even when employed, feel like they can't make a difference. So the higher that one has a sense of burdensomeness, they feel like they're not contributing to society. And if you consider mental health conditions like depression and anxiety and substance use, this further exacerbates feelings of burdensomeness for individuals. And coupled with that in this model of risk is this idea of thwarted belongingness. This is when we see folks starting to withdraw, struggling with mental health, in addition to feeling like they just don't belong, whether it's at work, at home, in their community. And this is where we talk about issues of discrimination and prejudice, as well as workplace bullying, having serious implications for increasing suicide risk. So when you put these together, risk increases. And Thomas Joiner talks about this third construct called capability for suicide. And this actually talks about one having a means to die by suicide. This could be due to having access to lethal means, which we'll talk about, whether it be firearms or medications, but it also has to do with a buildup of experiences in one's life of trauma, of childhood traumas, exposures to violence, or thinking about exposure to military combat. All of these experiences over time have an impact to decrease one's fear of death and actually increase our pain tolerance. So in the middle here, you see the high risk for suicide attempt or death is when these three things converge together. And so the idea that someone has suicidal thoughts is going to attempt suicide is not usually the case, as we'll show you some numbers. But when these factors all come together, risk is very high. And it's important for us as EAP professionals to think about at what point does ideation move into behavior? And what are some points where we can have intervention to reduce risk? Next slide. So this is data from the CDC from 2017, which is our most comprehensive data in thinking about overall deaths at almost 48,000 for the United States. And then you can also see from the National Survey on Drug Use and Mental Health that 1.5 million adults 18 and over have made at least one suicide attempt in their lifetime. And then at the bottom of the pyramid, we see here that 11 million have seriously considered suicide. So the impact in thinking about our workplace and where to intervene is important to think about not only suicide deaths, but also attempts and ideation. Now, these numbers have been increasing statistically over time, despite the work that we've been doing. And I think one point to look at in this graph that actually we see as somewhat hopeful is the fact that while we have 11 million people who are thinking about suicide, the majority of them do not attempt or die by suicide. And so what we're seeing here is that while suicide and suicide attempts take a tremendous toll on individuals and communities, there are also a number of people in our workplaces, in our families, in our communities that are living and thriving even with suicide ideation. And I want to mention just quickly the financial toll of suicide, because that comes up in our field where we might have to make the business case. The numbers are really kind of all over the place, and the data is a little tricky, but we know that in addition to the emotional and psychological costs of suicide, there are costs related to medical and particularly job loss costs. So the Suicide Prevention and Resource SPRC website has some recent studies that look at suicide costs, estimating that costs are for one suicide are over $1 million. And 97% of that cost estimation comes from lost productivity, and then coupled with the medical treatment. So investing in suicide prevention is important and does have significant returns. But again, thinking about who's been considering suicide and attempting in the workplace has a lot of emotional costs that don't get captured. Next slide. So this kind of goes into that point about exposure. And what we can see here, the big takeaway here is that a significant number of people, even who are further away from the suicide death, feel some kind of exposure and loss. And the majority of Americans actually will experience increased risk because of how they are connected to someone who dies by suicide or attempts suicide. So obviously, in terms of the major life disruption, we look at, this is Julie Sorrell's work from 2016 of 25 people being impacted. But if you think about the workplace and a coworker, we can see about life disruption for 53 individuals and then having some effects up to 115. So the closer that we are to someone who attempts or dies by suicide, the more interruption and then subsequent increased risk for suicide that we will experience as well. So this is a good map to think about kind of exposure for a workplace and responding to a suicide. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Sally to talk a little bit about recovery and how we're dealing with suicide in the era of coronavirus as well.
Thank you, Jody. So we get a lot of questions about, is this COVID crisis going to increase the suicide death risk, and what are we going to do? And many of us are cautiously answering that. And the reason why is because we also know there's a phenomenon that happens when you predict a negative outcome and then you create a narrative or a script that people then live into. And the truth of the matter is we don't really know. We don't really know how this is going to impact. And with the way that the data are collected, we probably won't know the impact that it's had on suicide for many years to come. We do know that it's kind of a perfect storm of risk in a lot of ways, with increased unemployment, increased firearm purchasing. We have data already of increased substance use, increased domestic violence. We have decreased welfare calls on children because they're not in school. So all of these risk factors have us worried. But at the same time, we do know that when we have large scale disasters like COVID, there are also opportunities where people pull together. Historically, this is true for war. This is also, it was true immediately after 9/11. People pulled together. So we're going to watch the data and notice what's happening. But this is the crisis curve that SAMHSA published, and we can kind of map ourselves onto it, right? We had this long pre-disaster waiting phase that was very anxiety provoking for many people. When is it going to hit? Is this really a thing? How is it going to impact us? And then we had a period of heroism where we were, and still are, very much celebrating our essential workers, especially our healthcare workers. People were making masks, they were bringing food over to their neighbors, and it kind of felt a little bit like we were pulling together. I think now we are definitely seeing the effects of the disillusionment phase, where it's hard and it's long-term hard, and we have these layers of the social unrest on top of the COVID crisis, and that's been very explosive because it's been a long time coming, but also because we were like a pile of tinder waiting to explode when George Floyd was murdered. So we have it's to be expected that we would have lots of conflict and unrest, disillusionment, hopelessness, helplessness, and so forth. And then hopefully at some point, we'll start looking at what the reconciliation and reconstruction phases might look like, when we will have more bumps in the road around this, and what we will learn through this. Now, that all said, next slide, all the best models in the world are just that, they're models. This is actually what people's experiences are mostly like day to day. We could have all of those feelings all at once, or oscillate between them. And so it just kind of gives us a potential roadmap for looking forward into the future, but also knowing that it's a complicated and unprecedented time. Next slide. So one of the pivoting turning points in getting traction in workplace suicide prevention was when the CDC started to come out with reports ranking industry by suicide death. Now, if you remember back in the beginning when I met with John Kinning, and then even when I met with Chris Carlo and Juan Vigil, we didn't have the kind of data that we have today that legitimizes a suicide-specific conversation in the workplace. There were lots of workplace wellness initiatives happening back in the day. There were lots of workplace mental health things happening. But even within our own circles, we have some prejudice and discrimination for tackling suicide head-on. The CDC reports changed that. They started ranking industry and occupational groups by risk of suicide, and for the first time ever, we had really solid, credible data to make our argument that suicide-specific interventions were needed. So this data here that you see are from the most recent report, which was January 24th, 2020, Peterson and colleagues, looking more granularly at the 32 states, which were the data that they had at the time, and ranking from death certificates, the industry that the person was associated with their suicide rates. And so as you can see, construction and extraction is number one. And that's true for both males and females. Then you'll see mostly a lot of the male-dominated industries rise to the top, because we do know that about 80% of people who die by suicide are male. Now, I'll just make a really important note here that suicide death is, again, only one of the ways that suicide crises show up at work. Suicide attempts, suicidal thoughts and feelings, caregiving for people who are experiencing suicidal intensity, grieving, all of these things are also impacting suicide, impacting the workplace. So this is just one way to look at it. And we're also concerned about our first responders, our healthcare workers. You think about how COVID is impacting those industries, how COVID is also impacting the arts and sports industries. So it's been about every 2 years that the CDC has been reporting these data. So it'll be interesting to see how COVID impacts these. But these are also the industries that are coming to the table much more quickly, meeting solutions and strategies. Next slide. Very, very quickly, I want to let you know that this work of developing national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention has been a long time coming. Back in 2010, we stood up the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. It's a public-private partnership designed to move forward the national strategy for suicide prevention. And at the time that was launched, I was the executive secretary. And one of the first things we did was establish task forces, groups that were actually going to do the work of implementing the national strategy. And the Workplace Task Force was one of the founding task force. And right away, we started bringing together the people who were leading the thinking and the research and the activities, and the EAP world was very well represented by Jody and many others. And we started looking about what we could do as a task force. And we quickly learned that both Canada and Australia had some sense of a national direction around workplace suicide prevention. Canada has some psychological safety standards that are operated through government structures. Australia had a national position statement coming from their national suicide prevention group for workplaces. And we thought, well, we need to catch up. And so we started getting groups together to look at this and what we could do. And we started partnering with AAS and AFSP. It was in the summer of 2018 that we started to do some focus groups, interviews, and launching a survey. And on October 10th of 2019, we launched the guidelines. We then transitioned this committee over to the umbrella of the American Association of Suicidology, where it lives today. Next slide. So polling question number 2, we also find it very interesting just to take a pulse check on people's lived experience with suicide. This is, again, just one question we could ask in this space. Have you lost someone close to you? This could be a friend or family member. It could also be a coworker or a colleague. When we do this work workplaces, it's often very eye-opening because many people have these experiences. They just don't know this about each other. And it often makes a difference in people's passion and connection and motivation to do this work in the workplace. And that's about what we see. Sometimes in high-risk industries like construction and first responder communities, we'll see rates that are closer to 75%, 80%. And again, these are often in communities where this has not been a topic of conversation before, so it's very eye-opening for the participants. Thank you. You can close that out. Next slide. We'll move on now to justification. Why does this matter, and why does it need to be suicide specific? Well, it's because the workplace is the last crucible of sustained human contact for the now, probably in 2019, we will surpass 50,000 people who kill themselves each year in the United States. A coworker suicide has deep, disturbing impact on workmates. For managers, such tragedies pose challenges no one ever covered in management school. Now, this was a quote from an article published in 2001, and this quote is still very, very true today. The workplace as a public health system is, I'm going to argue, the most important system for suicide prevention. We do know that most people who die by suicide never make it to a mental health provider, but most of them are working, or they were just working, or they have an immediate family member who's working. So when you think about points of access for intervention, the workplace is probably the most cross-cutting system that we have, at least for adults. Number 2, these are the coworkers are unaddressed grieving, and that is showing up and having massive impact. And then 3rd, managers who are often in a position to make a difference often feel responsibility for the well-being of their workers and have no idea how to address this, and are also very fearful of addressing it. And when we are frightened and unprepared, we often don't behave well. And so we often do things that cause more harm than do help. Next slide. This is not a new conversation, although I'll tell you that in the United States, our story that we tell about suicide has become much more narrow. It was over 100 years ago that Emil Durkheim positioned the workplace as an important social structure in understanding suicide and suicide prevention. But over the years, at least in the United States, we have changed that narrative to say, no, 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 it's all about mental health, and mental health providers are the only ones who can make a difference here. It's way too complicated for the everyday person. Don't touch it. Only mental health providers can deal with this. And that has actually gotten us into a lot of trouble because it's not that mental health professionals can't do good work here, although most of us were unprepared by our graduate training. It's just that people who are often most at risk for suicide death are not seeing their despair through a mental health framework, and so they're not reaching out to mental health services. So to engage the workplace makes a lot of sense. There's a number of things that Durkheim argued that will bring back those arguments because it's showing up in the research to make a difference. It's a place where people have identity. It's a place where people have, when it's working well, a sense of purpose, a sense of social connection. And when it's not working well, when the workplace starts to disintegrate, people suffer greatly. Sense of, not being connected, not being able to contribute, to provide to their family or contribute to their community matters greatly in how they make meaning out of their life. Next slide. I'll turn it back over to Jody.
Jump in, and I'm going to go very quickly through the next couple slides, and the slides will all be available, and at the end of our slide deck there's probably 10 slides that we're calling our appendix, where there are more details about some of the steps we took for developing the guidelines. Next slide. So our major mission is to try to engage employers and professional associations. Again, as I mentioned today, the big takeaway is to understand prioritizing suicide as a health and safety priority. And we knew that we needed to provide a roadmap to employers that wanted to engage in this. And that's really what we've been doing, in addition to enrolling workplaces to take ownership and responsibility in this public health challenge. We also want to provide them with the steps so that they have a place to begin and that they don't feel necessarily overwhelmed with how to take meaningful steps of engaging leadership, implementers, which we refer to as HR and managers, safety and wellness and legal folks. Collaborators are our community partners, investors, evaluators, and also, as Sally mentioned, the importance of peers, which we'll talk about. Next slide. So when we engaged in the development of these guidelines, we took what we called an exploratory analysis. So I'll walk you through a couple steps here. If you want to go to the next slide, Amy. So we engaged stakeholders, and a number of them were EAP, but also workplace leaders, in hearing what they wanted in terms of what resources they had, what were the gaps. And we knew that we had to have buy-in early on from leadership so that we could start to develop champions and storytellers. My friends on this call in EAP, we know there's nothing better for promoting EAP than having a champion in the workplace that talks positively about the program. And so that was kind of what we instilled in developing our strategy for a comprehensive strategy of suicide prevention that really was part of a learning community with leaders and workplaces that would always be evolving to meet the complex needs of the changing workplace. Next slide. So we did 13 focus groups, and thanks to some of you that may have participated in the EAP focus groups that we led. We also did 15 in-depth interviews, and we did a survey with over 250 respondents from 41 states. And about 60% were from mid and large size companies, and many of them held leadership management types of positions within their company. So what we found, again, we needed to think about strategies and approaches to bake in the principles and the practices of suicide prevention in a workplace. It wasn't a one-off training or a program here or a national depression screening day. It had to involve macro, micro, and even meso-level interventions. And we also found that from the surveys, the motivators to do this work were far and above 86% felt that this was an employee health and well-being initiative, and that 72%, they could answer more than once, which is why it's over 100%, that it was the right thing to do. But there were also some significant barriers that we identified. And the first one, 47%, talked about engaging leaders to get buy-in. And that still is a struggle today. And then also 40% lack of funding. And we know that doing a comprehensive plan for suicide, or really anything that we want to try to approach in the workplace, not only takes time, but also financial resources and investment. Next slide. So let's spend a little bit of time looking at the guiding principles. And if you go to www.workplacesuicideprevention.com, notice not .org or .edu as I'm used to in the university. The employers told us that it needed to be .com for them to take it seriously as leaders. So just thinking about messaging and strategies that may not be from where we're from in mental health or substance use backgrounds or other helping other helping disciplines is really important. So I'm going to do a quick overview of the 8 guiding principles. And please know that when you go on the website, you're going to be able to get access to materials that go deeper into this. And Sally will talk about how we're launching some additional steps that have training videos and examples of all of our principles and guidelines. So the first principle out of the 8 is strategic intervention. And as Durkheim mentioned, as Sally introduced, the workplace is very well positioned to be a part of this public health approach to suicide prevention. In fact, we need to be. But it's really important that when we think about our strategies, that we bake it in and not bolt it on. Thinking about economic recessions and programs that have come and gone, this has to be a solid part of a strategic plan for a workplace. It's not a one-off training or an awareness day. Those are important to incorporate, but it really needs to be a much more strategic program that thinks about where does health and safety show up in our workplace, and let's try to connect the dots so that in all those different places, there's messaging about suicide prevention. It also needs to be comprehensive and sustained. So this is where that investment of both human resources and money takes place. And we're really pushing employers to think about upstream approaches to suicide that would have a slow drip over time. So there's multiple touch points over the course of one's day at the workplace and over the course of one's career for managers and for every single employee in that workplace. The focus is on harm reduction. So we no longer equate suicide as a result of mental illness. In fact, the CDC tells us that a majority of folks that die by suicide had no known mental illness. Now, that doesn't say that depression and anxiety and substance use are not important risk factors, but we also need to think about the other environmental, social, and ecological causes of risk for suicide. And toxic work environments, as well as exposure to trauma, are right up there in the top. And those are things that we can start to address as EAPs, where we have our finger on the pulse of the workplace. So it's not good enough any longer for us to just get troubled employees to the counselors. We actually need to clean up the environment. And the workplace has a mandate under OSHA in this country to have a safe and healthy workplace. So let's think about harm reduction for suicide, particularly if it's showing up as a potential occupational hazard in the CDC data. The next one is culture cultivation. And Sally and others like to say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So what is the culture at the workplace? Is it one of fear? Is it one of collaboration? Is it more of competition? I think that we need to be, again, in that strategic integration, talking with workplace leaders about how to decrease feelings of belongingness or increase feelings of belongingness, and think about reducing isolation, rewarding behaviors that builds connected communities in the workplace. And leaders can have a huge impact, either positively or negatively, on the culture of our workplace. The next one that I'll mention is the dignity protection. And are there processes in place for protecting the dignity of your workers? Is there more that we can do? And my answer is yes, to fight against bullying, harassment, discrimination, and structural and systemic racism and prejudice in our workplace. So it gets back into culture cultivation, but also thinking about policies and practices. Remember Joiner's model of risk. Where can we work to change upstream approaches that will increase belongingness and purposefulness that will then have a positive impact on reducing suicide risk? In terms of well-being promotion, We do a lot of work in EAPs and crisis response, and many of us I know on the call have been really pushing on how we can be more preventative. And this is where the upstream comes up. So yes, we want to be there for someone in crisis. We want to be there for a workplace after there's been a suicide attempt or a death. But we also want to empower folks to think about a life worth living, not just preventing death, but how do we improve quality of life? And the workplace plays such a key potential part in that. So let's think about as a field being more proactive and preventative. And the second to last is empowered connection. And this is, some of you that have been around in the field for a long time, you'll remember the warm transfer. Do we really do that anymore? And it's not really just for EAPs, but do all of our employees and peers and managers understand the importance of connecting folks to effective treatment, including peer support? Is everyone prepared to help link compassionately employees to care? So taking that idea of warm transfer that we used to value so much in EAP to help the workplace understand what are the resources and how do we reduce the barriers at all levels of the work organization. And the last guiding principle that we've identified from our data is the action orientation. And again, awareness is necessary, but not sufficient for social change. So we need to consider more than just our programs by helping workplace leaders look at policies, trainings, and also thinking about ongoing assessment of the organization to continuously improve. For example, how long did we know smoking was bad for us and we kept doing it? So action is needed. And one thing that I would stress for EAPs is how we can help workplace leaders make actionable, measurable goals that they can then also be held accountable for. Next slide. Thanks, Amy. So the 9 practices that we're excited to introduce you to are really a mindset on how we can think about strategies that are upstream, midstream, and downstream for workplaces and professional organizations to go on this path of making suicide a health and safety priority. And the first one is leadership. That's so critical. That was about 50% of our survey respondents said this was a major barrier to doing this work. Leadership sets the tone. And so we really need to have champions at the top that will see suicide prevention as a critical and ethical responsibility in their workplace. They can help us to tell stories, they can help us to promote programs, they can allocate resources, and they can help change the culture so that it's one more of well-being and safety at all levels. We also need to think about job strain reduction. And so there's some really interesting research that recently particularly came out of Australia with the late Alison Milner that focused on toxic work environments. And these are things that we know as EAPs and that we see show up in terms of bullying and discrimination and harassment and more structural and systemic issues about racism, job autonomy, again, feeding into Joiner's model of not being able to contribute to society or feeling isolated or feeling rejected from the workplace, not feeling like I am valued. So these increase risk factors, and they're actually things that we can work to reduce with workplaces that we partner with. So it's important to think about what are some of the hazards at our workplace and what are the policies and programs that we can help to advise about as EAPs and then help to promote that will reduce those toxic work contributors to suicide. In terms of communication, this is important on all levels. Some of you are in construction, some of you are in first responder communities. The communication that you're going to use is maybe different than what we would use in a healthcare system or an educational system where others of you are working. So that mental health literacy and access to care is really critical, but doing it in a way that's not cookie cutter and really responsive to the needs of the culture of the workplace is important. We also want to make sure our screening, whether it be a National Depression Screening Day or promoting a mental health app, particularly during this time of physical distancing, is that we help people understand the resources and awareness and give them opportunities to go moving kind of into that self-care orientation or the next practice where they can have some of the tools to do their own work. Because we know that not everybody is going to make it to the EAP. We know that not everybody will make it to mental health professionals and even peers. That brings in training, and Sally's got some wonderful resources that she's really led the way in building a stratified suicide prevention response. And what this means is everybody needs some kind of training. You think about CPR, and there's programming out there so that we all can have an active role in preventing suicide. But there's different levels of training that might be needed for managers versus EAPs versus peers or HR providers. Moving into peer support. So we've seen a lot of great examples in our workplaces, particularly with first responders, where peers are able to work as well-being ambassadors. The airline industry, some folks are involved with on the call, have a peer system model as well, where we can work with peers that are engaging with coworkers all the time for formal and informal initiatives, and then having that relationship to be able to provide warm transfers and successful connections with additional health and well-being resources, including but not limited to EAP. And that brings us to the last three, where EAP really gets involved. And this is, what is the investment in the mental health? What types of services are we offering as EAP, and what kind of background do we have? I created a 1-credit course for the School of Nursing and School of Social Work on suicide risk assessment and response. And most of the students feel like this should be required for everybody. Why is it an elective? Why is it only 1 credit? They're not learning this in any other parts of their graduate education. So we're still really behind in terms of how we learn to do this and then how we promote it. But we do need to be there also to mitigate risk and crisis response. And so mitigating risk, talks a lot about thinking about the occupational hazards of the workplace, going back to some of the more macro issues, but also thinking about access to lethal means. We see firearms as the major means used for suicide in the US. So is that something that your workplace has access to? Is there potentially policies and programs that could support reducing access to means? Or also thinking about healthcare with access to lethal medication. And then finally, crisis response. And I don't know that we'll get time to talk too much about the Postvention guide that I hope many of you have already seen. But we need to be there as an EAP for providing immediate support, but also helping that workplace to reintegrate someone back to work, to talk with the workplace about Postvention, and to be supportive so leaders can lead effectively during times of crisis. Next slide. So moving into some proposed solutions, Sally's going to talk a little bit about the upstream approaches, and then I'll bring us home with some of the downstream.
Thanks again, Jody. So many of you are familiar with the stream parable, and again, that's how we framed out the national guidelines. When people hear about suicide prevention, almost always they go to that crisis moment, and we absolutely need to show up with our best game. And so for those of you who are aware and have taken suicide-specific types of interventions for people who are experiencing intense suicidal thoughts and feelings, like CAMS and the crisis response work from Craig Bryan, DBT, all of these things. We have to show up with our best game with evidence-based or evidence-informed practices to help people work through those experiences and get back on their feet. But if that is our only focus, we're never going to get in front of suicide. We also need to do other things that help identify when suicide is coming onto the thought process, that first thought moment. We need to be bolstering the protective factors, both at the individual level and at the system level. Next slide. So taking another look at the practices, our upstream approaches are the first 3 that we mentioned, and they're really, again, designed to build protective factors and prevent problems. Next slide. So these are just a handful of some of the job strain pieces that Jody's mentioned. There's actually probably 24 that have been connected in the literature directly to suicide. So when we control for things like depression and anxiety and even substance use, these things still stand out as being directly connected to suicide risk. So we need to be not only addressing the discrimination and prejudice aspects that Jody was mentioning, but job strain that comes from lack of job variety, work and family conflict, the feelings of being trapped, not feeling rewarded, like you're a cog in the machine, that you're only there for somebody else's profit or gain, etc. So next slide. So what are the paradigms that we've been sharing and to try, again, to change this mindset that only it's the mental health providers that can deal with this, is this this graph that is very familiar to people that have a high value of safety in their workplace. NIOSH's hierarchy of control. You see this in almost every construction site that you go onto. People are very well versed that yes, on the downward part of this pyramid, getting all of our workers to wear their PPE, their personal protective equipment, is very important in worker safety. But we're going to do a much better job in eliminating harm if we're focused more on the safety threats that are happening in the organization or on the job site. Same thing here. At the bottom of the pyramid, it's very important to get people who are suffering with suicidal intensity to the supports that could help them, like professional services or peers. But we're going to do a lot better if we focus on the environment and do our best to eliminate these psychosocial hazards and substitute them with things that promote well-being. Next slide. Midstream solutions are, again, about increasing early identification and triaging people to supports that are going to be least restrictive and most helpful. Going back again to some training that many of us had a while ago. It used to be, oh, if suicidal thoughts are on the menu, this led to, some kind of hold or some kind of, call 911 or kind of escalating the situation to a very restrictive thing. And we now know that involuntary holds, when we look at the aggregate data, actually increase risk rather than decrease. So we're really focused on midstream about accessing care that is least restrictive. So again, empowering people to learn to manage some of their own suicidal intensity, having a stratified training program so that more people can be involved in compassionate conversations around this, and then really working hard to build out a peer support tier that is going to be effective. Next slide. So this is what Jody was referring to earlier. A lot of workplaces, especially those that are very safety conscious, have annual CPR training. So if you link this idea of a stratified training program onto the model of CPR that they already do and understand, it makes sense. It makes sense on why we need booster sessions. It makes sense on why we have to retrain people every year. So same thing here with suicide specific, what we call gatekeeper trainings. They're just between an hour and a half and 3 hours long. You can train a lot of people in just basic awareness of what to look for, how to engage in compassionate conversations, and how to do those warm handoffs and follow up to make sure that people engage in those things that can help support them. So that's the bottom part of the tier. Then you need an advanced training for peers or managers or people who are going to have a higher likelihood of coming into contact with people who are experiencing suicide grief or suicidal intensity. And at the top, our mental health providers need to regularly update their skill sets on suicide-specific risk assessment, management, and recovery tools. The science around this is evolving all the time. So I'm really encouraged to see that many states are now requiring continuing education for our mental health providers that is suicide-specific, so that we can really strengthen that part of the safety net. Next slide. So going back to the RK story, this video clip that we'll show you now was taken a couple years after John and I had that coffee and he started to do the work. And I like to show it because it really does model a number of things. It models what it looks like to bake this into health and safety culture. It models what it looks like to have a peer be empowered to care about their peers around suicide-specific types of conversations. And it models what leaders look like when they talk about this in a way that they're proud that they've taken early steps. Next, go ahead and play the video. You have to share the audio. Okay, we might not get this. When you shared the slide deck, and you needed to toggle the piece that said share the audio. Okay,
we'll send a link out for that.
We'll send the link out.
Still on YouTube, but what you see in there is the construction industry having
their own life.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, you got it.
The federal government's out with a first-of-kind report looking at suicide rates by occupation, and it's confirmed what they suspected at a mechanical contracting firm in Denver. Our Kyle Dyer takes on a subject that could use more open discussion. Colonel, how are you? Good to see you.
These hellos at the start of each day could not be more sincere.
Good morning, how are you? How are you? Good, how are you? Good to see you. Job going good for you?
As the RK team gets ready for another day on the construction site,
How are you, sir? Good. Good to see you.
Tom Alvarez makes a point to check in with everyone.
All right, guys, let's kind of wind up over here.
And then he gathers up the RK crew for their toolbox talk.
So we ask you to, please keep your eyes and ears open.
Alvarez is the safety manager at RK. Yes, safety as in not getting injured accidentally. But Alvarez is also determined to make sure his workers do not intentionally hurt themselves.
We had an employee that was had worked for us, and he'd been going through some issues at home. And he came in, started divvying out his tools to people, and then he went home one night and committed suicide. Why did RK decide to do this?
Back then, Alvarez thought that colleague was changing his career. No one at RK recognized the warning signs of suicide. But that has changed over the last 2 years.
We're changing our cultures.
As RK faces the fact that construction is the #2 industry when it comes to suicide among the workforce. Now everyone is aware of the symptoms of depression.
If they see somebody not on the job, maybe 10 years ago, they would say, they write them up when they get in the next morning for not showing up for work. We've changed our culture. It's like, now what's going on in your life? And I think that's just part of the evolution of construction too.
Michelle Brown was approached by a coworker who was really struggling. Because of the awareness training, she knew exactly what to do.
To be able to reach out to that person and to get them the help they needed, and to be the individual that they could talk to, laugh with, cry with, it was incredible.
And Brown says that man is now thriving. Kinning, RK's executive VP, says he also knows of workers who have turned away from the thought of suicide because of the support they received at work. So the training and the toolbox talks will continue. They have to.
We're a family-owned business. We care about people's families. We want them to come to work and be able to go home from work safe.
With photojournalist Adam Vance, Kyle Dyer, 9 News.
You'll be hearing more about suicide prevention in September, the month dedicated to raising awareness. It was about this time last year that Kyle told us a similar mental health support program that operates the Denver Fire Department.
Thanks, Amy. Amy, you're a rock star, by the way.
Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of go quickly through some slides because we want to be able to have a chance to tell you about the badge system and what's going on with the guidelines. Again, the slides are available, and we also sent out an article that we wrote for the Journal of Employee Assistance that goes into a bit deeper dive with some resources for EAPs if you're looking for training or if you're looking for screening tools, and I'm always happy to chat offline, as is Sally. We did want to highlight, this is the program that Maggie directs from the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention called the Interactive Screening Program. I'm actually in the process of evaluating it for 21 work organizations that have taken an approach to offer anonymous risk screening and response, as well as dialogue with both EAPs and peer counselors about suicide and mental health and well-being even more broadly. And so this is a really interesting program to check out if you're not familiar. One of the really nice unintended consequences of implementing this is it's also helping with EAP utilization because of the way it gets promoted in the work organization. Next slide. So that kind of brings us into that's a bridge from midstream to downstream approaches. And the downstream approaches are really critical. So right now I'm consulting with a number of employers, and they're asking me, what can we ask from our EAP? And I do give them some tips of what they can ask and evaluate, but you better believe it, I kick it right back at them to say, well, how are you promoting it? And how are you investing in your programs? And are they really a strategic partner? Because the EAP alone in these downstream solutions is not going to prevent suicide or change culture, as so many of us are anxious to really be more of a part of. But it is important to think about how well prepared or ill prepared are we as an EAP with our affiliate networks to be able to work specifically with suicide crisis and risk. We do need to start taking an audit and a sense of our practitioners in terms of what their training is or is not. Several states, as Sally mentioned, are starting to require for licensing continuing education hours in suicide prevention and suicide risk assessment and treatment, which is fabulous. But again, the majority of social workers, psychologists, and other licensed professionals in mental health do not have specific suicide risk training. Next slide. So thinking about, well, what is the approach? Sally wrote an article that I contributed to called Kicking the Tires to Your Mental Health Providers. And this is super popular, particularly with the construction and manufacturing audiences, as you can imagine. But it's really thinking about, what are folks doing in terms of screening? Are they using standardized measures like the Columbia Suicide risk assessment or the ASQ, or at the very least the PHQ-9? Are you referring to evidence-based interventions like the CAMS Care by David Jobs or Suicide Prevention CBT? There are interventions that, again, will specifically focus on suicide ideation and risk that have been shown to have evidence in reducing suicide risk versus doing family therapy and hoping that maybe the suicide ideation will subside. That is not evidence-based care for suicide. So it's really important to think, critically about what we are doing and what we're not doing and where there might be some opportunities to improve. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into the Postvention guide. I'm hoping many of you have seen it. It's available on our website. It's been around for several years and has been used not only by EAP professionals, but managers and HR providers to think about acute, short-term and long-term reactions to suicide. So Amy, we're going to go kind of quickly through this, but I'll talk about it as you advance the slides. One of the great things about the guide, if you haven't seen it, is it actually gives examples, for example, of sample letters of how to do notifications. It talks about legal protection and privacy. It gives checklists in terms of what I should be thinking about initially after a suicide death or attempt, and how I should focus then on short-term and long-term. Next slide. So these are just a couple key components that you can look at. It's very, very practical. A number of EAP folks you'll recognize as contributors to this guide, and the feedback we've received is that it's very helpful. Next slide. And it includes very heavily the ability to promote and link to EAP, as well as other community-based resources for grieving. Next slide. I think long-term for managers, it's really important to help them understand the anniversary and milestones. A lot of times folks are like, that was a year ago, or that was 2 years ago from a critical incident. And we know that there are a number of milestones and specific dates, or even important meetings where an employee would have contributed in the past that can trigger some trauma reaction and response. So keeping that in mind from an EAP is something we can really help to contribute to help leaders understand. Next slide. I'm actually, I think we're going to skip this polling question and move into the pledge, which I'm going to have Sally provide some of the most recent updates in terms of our website and how now you can have a role in becoming more actively involved.
Great, thanks, Jody. So our call to action for all of you and for all of you, the workplaces that you connect with, is to take the pledge to make suicide prevention a health and safety priority in the workplace. And once people take the pledge and register and get involved, they get into the back end of our website where they can earn badges by taking specific action steps towards building out that comprehensive and sustained strategy. The badge system that we have, think of it like a scouting badge system. They're small action steps, but it builds momentum and starts to, again, reward and recognize the workplaces that are doing the right thing. And then they have something to share externally to show that they've been, early adopters, or that they've been investing in this area. Next slide. So since we launched, we have now upwards of 300 pledge partners. We've gotten some good media engagement, and we're starting to now build out that pledge program even further. Hopefully in the next 2 weeks or so, we'll have a much more robust pledge activity behind the registration page. So again, you have to register first to get into that. And then you get access to a community of practice, some specific action steps that you can take, and so forth. And you're earning badges toward becoming a suicide-informed organization. Now, this is for workplaces, it's professional associations, it's for unions, it's for anyone who wants to make suicide prevention a health and safety priority. Next slide. This is what the badges look like. And believe it or not, even today, we still all chase carrots. We have a lot of people saying, come on, get your badge system up. We need it right now. We have hunger right now in the midst of this crisis to really invest and take some steps in this area. So you get the bronze one just for pledging, just for saying publicly this matters to us. And then with the silver, gold, and platinum ones, you get badges for doing a needs and strengths assessment and taking a couple of action steps in the practices that rise to the top for you. And then at the end, you can say that you have, you've gone through the pledge system to become suicide informed. Next slide. So good. I think we're kind of on time. How did that work out, Judy? I'm not sure.
So we do have a couple ending slides. So
yeah.
Why don't we do some Q&A, and then Amy, if you can share our screen back at like about 3 minutes to 11, we'll do a quick conclusion if that's okay. So I would just say we have some time for Q&A, and if you're not talking, keep yourself on mute would probably be easiest with the number of people on Zoom. But if you do want to ask us a question, we'll try our best to answer.
Or you could drop questions in the chat.
Yeah, you can also put your questions in the chat. And just to reiterate, the slides are available. There's a number of appendices that are after our presentation included in the slide deck that'll be available to you. There's lots of material on workplacesuicideprevention.com that you can drop into communications if you're ready to start engaging and take the badge. And the article from the Journal of Employee Assistance has also a number of resources for some of the trainings and the screening tools that we mentioned, and we can chat more about them.
As we're waiting for a question to come in, I just have one other comment that I wanted to make, which was that it was very important to us from the outset that the voices of lived experience were front and center in the development of these guidelines and as quality assurance moving forward. So Chris Carlo did facilitate a focus group on peers. We had a number of other groups that came to the forefront of people who had their suicide crisis or their suicide loss while they were working, and they had a voice with equal footing with the employment lawyers and the HR folks about what did they wish they had, and how did it go for them, and what went well and what went horribly wrong. And we enrolled those voices and perspectives as we shape these things.
I got a quick question. When you're approaching more white-collar workplaces versus unionized workplaces, is the approach any different, or is it pretty much standardized across the board?
It's pretty much standardized across the board. So the bones of the guidelines are pretty universal. And the first step really is listen to your people. Do the same kind of thing that we did to build these guidelines. Do that in your organization by doing focus groups and in-depth interviews and surveys to kind of see where people are at and thinking about this, where the pain points are, where the barriers are, where the strengths are, and then create the system around that. That's a pretty universal approach for systems change. And when you start there, by the time you roll out the different components of communication and training and so forth, people say, oh, that's right, you listen to us. This is by, about, and for us. And that has gone well within healthcare systems. I do some work in the service industry. A lot of restaurants right now are really suffering, and the entertainment industry, even the legal industry. There's not a lot of modification in the big structural processes. When you get down to the implementation, of course, there's going to be some cultural responsiveness that's going to be needed so that people can really feel like this was by, about, and for them.
I would also add, working with unions, the safety link is obviously such a nice bridge, I think, between EAP managers and unions. It's a no-brainer. I always, use that. But it is funneling up actually to other industries. And one of the reasons that I'm seeing that with, particularly with large employers and a lot of self-insured employers, is that the lack of network connection when someone actually does get to the EAP or a peer program, they're still not getting the access to care they need in the community. And that's coming up to the C-suite level. So they are beginning to see that there are real gaps in our broken mental health care system and wondering, again, they initially are like, Jody, what can we do for our EAP to be better? And I reframed that question very quickly in thinking about us as a culture and a workplace and how the EAP can be a partner in that. But we can't fix the broken mental health care system alone. And I think that for the safety and health initiatives, that case maybe like 5 or 10 years ago was still much harder to make with employers, but they are bringing those issues to me and to other researchers and consultants, just wondering, like, at this point, we're ready to take it on ourselves. So I'm not seeing the same resistance as I did back in the day about workplace suicide prevention. I mean, yes, still some companies in their particular industry don't necessarily want to be the first one to take it on. But we have over 300 employers, many of those names you would recognize. So we're hoping they put their badges up soon as we move forward with the workplace. I think it's, there's been a shift, and people are just asking for this information and what they can do. We're not having to fight as much. We still have to do it some though, Maya, but it really is shifting in terms of a public health approach to suicide prevention.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I had a question. The appendix you may be covering, or I'm sure is on the websites as well, related to the evidence-based treatments and assessments, and especially right now is probably for a time period many of us are going to continue to be supporting the workplaces virtually, or doing virtual assessments and treatment. Do you have, related to treatment or assessment, recommendations for the best tools to use or approaches in supporting employees?
Yeah, there is some material on the website. And so within each of the practice guidelines, there's some opportunities to get training. And most of those organizations are either now offering the trainings online or they're quickly figuring out how to do it. Like a safe talk training from Living Works would be one for, thinking about that gatekeeper initial training. If you're looking for more specific with, doing risk assessment in different occupational industry groups, you've got Dr. Paul Quinnett with the QPR Institute is all fully online with both gatekeeper, but also more advanced 2 1 and 2 day full day trainings for mental health professionals and healthcare professionals. CAMS, which is an intervention, the Collaborative Assessment of Management of Suicidology by David Jobs, is one of the evidence-based programs. So CAMS Care is now currently offering training online. There's a bunch of them. So there are some resources in a slide coming up where you can find some of that. And if there's a specific need that you have that isn't addressed there, feel free to email Sally or myself. And there are some resources that are out there.
Yeah, I'll just also, Working Minds is another gatekeeper training that's specifically about suicide prevention in the workplace. We are also now able to do not only the training, but the train the trainer model online. So that's just another resource that addresses some of the workplace specific nuances of suicide prevention that create opportunities and also challenges.
I see a question in the chat about healthcare providers and suicide. And so there is a lot of research going on right now. I actually have a grant under review specifically for working within hospital systems. So I think there'll be more information coming out. But for healthcare providers, what I've seen a little bit of a shift with the different EAP organizations I'm involved with nationally is at first, folks, the utilization was actually decreasing. And so some of that is because people were they just didn't have time to call counselors and seek help. There was a lot of requests for webinars and trainings, and now that's really starting to shift. If you think about a model of resilience and our rubber band can only be stretched so far, folks are starting to really reach a point of burnout with being not only exposed to traumas ongoing, but not necessarily having resources and not having interventions that can help folks with COVID. So this is a perfect storm for some really scary, dangerous reactions emotionally. And I think more EAPs are starting to tell me that their utilizations are going back up as people get more comfortable also with having the online counseling. So for healthcare in particular, frontline workers, that is an area that I think we'll see a lot more research come out.
We have a couple of committee members that are evangelists in this space. Dr. Lois Swisher is an emergency room physician and I'm sure many of you heard the high-profile suicide death of the New York City emergency room physician that really has galvanized that community to move forward with better and more aggressive suicide prevention measures for their community. So we're hoping that she actually established the Physician Suicide Prevention Day, which happens in September. So we've got some really great thought leaders and advocates that are moving this forward into all kinds of different industries.
I have a question.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, this is Laurie, and I just wonder, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Could you speak a little bit to some of these resources in adapting them for a death in the workplace that is not a suicide?
I think, Lori, I think the Postvention guide actually would be really useful because it has, Bob Vanderpool was one of the lead authors on that in terms of, leading the field with crisis response when he was with Crisis Care Network, and is still very involved. So I think what you'll find is a lot of the messaging suicide specific can also really be adapted for other types of unexpected deaths and complicated grief. So I think that would be a good resource actually.
Okay.
And Lori, I'd be happy to chat with you offline on that. So I think for time, I know I have to chair another meeting at 11, which is about homecoming, as you saw in the chat early on, is Monday. So hopefully all of you can join us at the School Social Work Homecoming. We're celebrating 40 years of social work in the workplace and employee assistance with critical convos about race, gender, health, culture. All these topics will be addressed on Monday, so please take a look. But I want to have an opportunity to kind of finish up the slides and just again to say thank you for allowing us the time and the space to present on this important topic with you. So Sally, you want to close?
Yeah, go ahead. Next slide, please. So in the chat, if you would, please write a 30-day commitment of one action step you're willing to take based on the content of this presentation. If you walk away and 2 weeks from now you totally forgot this, Jody and I did not do our job. And we know, right, from all of the behavioral change literature that if you write it down and say it out loud in front of your peers, you're far more likely to do it. So go ahead and put one action step. Maybe you'll read the Joiner book, maybe you'll look into some trainings. And I'll go ahead and close with another story. Next slide, please. And then we'll come back and look at your list. So going back to Juan again. So I told you Juan was very fearful about doing this video, but that ended up being the most remembered thing 6 months afterwards. Juan has now been promoted twice within the Denver Fire Department and is really revered as an authentic leader. And his supervisors say that whole experience of kind of disclosing his story and becoming a peer advocate has absolutely changed him. The night you saw in the video clip at the end of the construction video clip, it said this is a similar story that we did about the Denver Fire Department. Well, they approached the Denver Fire Department, 9 News did, and Juan was the first one to raise his hand. He said, yes, I will go talk on statewide television about my experiences, and because it's important, it's the right thing to do. He's now gone on to be a national champion for suicide prevention and fire service, and we remain close friends today. On the night that the 9 News piece aired, he texted me and he said, Sally, thank you for encouraging me to be so courageous in such an important area. This is some of the most important work that I have done. And so I just want to highlight that, sometimes people say, oh, you'll never get my fill in the blank to talk about suicide. My lawyers, my construction workers, my first responders, my doctors. Oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. If Juan Vigil can talk about suicide, your folks can too. You just need to give them that safe space and empower them to tell their story in a way that they know that they can make meaning and help others with it. Next slide. So these are some of the resources that you'll find in the article that we wrote and on the workplace suicideprevention.com website. Again, these are all things that you can get involved with. And any things coming out on the 30-day commitment that are of interest as we go to this last slide?
Oh yeah, but definitely my favorite is from Chad that he's going to go get some of those badges.
Nice. I love it. I love it. And yes, you get a badge just for pledging and registering. So that's an easy low-hanging fruit badge. All right. So in conclusion, to give Jody a second.
Training and reading the book, talking with peers. Great job, everyone. We're excited to help you through this on your commitment.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you
the
all.
village is ever expanding of those of us who are really pushing this forward. So thanks for coming in. So we'll give Jody 1 second to grab a glass of water before her next meeting, and I'll just close with this. This is you're the next nexus of this movement. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And then last slide, please stay connected. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. This was a great presentation. We appreciate you taking the time. I know you have a busy schedule. It's good to see you both. And
Good.
really, you've been updating more and more information, and we have more to come. So we're delighted. And we actually had 37 people. So I know we would have been
That's awesome.
cozy at Colmac today.
That's right. That's right. So I stay connected here also on all the social media platforms for us. Go ahead and connect with Workplace Suicide Prevention on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. All of our training videos and stuff are there. So we'd love to hear from you.
Great.
And
Thank you so
just
much.
in case you might not have been online, we already tweeted and Facebooked and LinkedIn that you were hosting this presentation, DC EAPA chapter. So kudos for doing this. Thank you. And a special thanks to Amy. She looks so calm in her profile picture. I'd be sweating bullets, but thank you for our technology support. It was just wonderful. And so if there is an opportunity to get the recording, Amy, you and I could connect. I have a large file transfer. I'm happy to cut back the discussion if we want. EAPA can decide, what you want to share. I can put it up on websites and